In December 1978, one of the most audacious robberies in American history unfolded inside the cargo terminal of New York's John F. Kennedy Airport. Nearly $6 million in cash and jewelry vanished in a matter of minutes. No alarms, no gunfire, no witnesses who could explain exactly how it happened. For years, the crime would become legendary inside organized crime circles. The heist was efficient, disciplined, and almost surgical. A perfect operation. But when Hollywood retold the story 2 decades later, the narrative changed. In the 1990 film Goodfellas, the Lufthansa Heist became one of the most memorable moments in mafia cinema. In the movie's version of events, Henry Hill stood near the center of the conspiracy, a trusted associate who helped orchestrate the robbery and watched as the aftermath spiraled into paranoia and murder. The film turned Hill into a key architect of the crime. But according to investigators, court records, and surviving mob associates, the truth was far more complicated. The film never showed how distant Henry Hill actually was from the planning of the heist, or how the real power behind the robbery had little interest in sharing the spotlight. To understand what really happened inside the Lufthansa cargo terminal, the story must begin years earlier, long before the robbery was even imagined. It begins inside the underworld of Brooklyn. Henry Hill was not born into the mafia. Unlike many of the men he later surrounded himself with, Hill had no Italian blood. That single fact meant he could never become a made member of the organization. He would never take the oath, never rise to the highest ranks of the family. But in the streets of East New York during the 1950s, that distinction meant very little. Hill grew up fascinated by the men who operated out of a neighborhood cab stand known as the Vario Crew. The location itself was unremarkable, a simple storefront along Pitkin Avenue. But behind its doors operated one of the most active criminal groups in Brooklyn, part of the Lucchese crime family. From the outside, it looked like a taxi dispatch office. Inside, it was a headquarters for loan sharks, hijackers, bookmakers, and thieves. The crew was controlled by a quiet but powerful capo named Paul Vario. Vario rarely raised his voice. He rarely appeared in public disputes, but his authority was absolute. Young Henry Hill watched the men around Vario with admiration. They drove expensive cars. They wore tailored suits. They commanded fear without ever appearing to demand it. In Hill's own later recollections, he described the moment he realized the life he wanted. As a teenager, he began running errands for the crew. At first, the jobs were simple. Deliver packages, carry messages, stand lookout during small street operations. But organized crime has a way of testing loyalty slowly. Hill proved useful. More importantly, he proved reliable. By the early 1960s, he had become a trusted associate within the Vario crew. And through that crew, he met the 2 men who would shape the most dangerous years of his life: Jimmy Burke and Tommy DeSimone. Jimmy Burke was not Italian either, but that fact had never slowed him down. Burke had built a reputation as one of the most effective hijackers in New York. Trucks carrying valuable cargo had a way of disappearing when they passed through the neighborhoods controlled by Burke's crew. The stolen goods moved quickly through underground markets. Cigarettes, clothing, electronics, anything that could be sold fast and quietly. Burke understood logistics. He understood discipline. And he understood how to maintain control through fear. Unlike many mob figures, Burke rarely sought public attention. But those who worked with him understood something important. When Jimmy Burke planned a job, it usually succeeded. Henry Hill quickly became one of Burke's most trusted associates. He handled transportation, coordination, and communication between different members of the crew. Hill was not the mastermind of operations, but he was often close to the center of them. And then there was Tommy DeSimone. Tommy was younger, volatile, unpredictable. Where Burke operated with careful calculation, Tommy lived entirely in the moment. His temper was infamous. His violence, even more so. According to later testimony from multiple mob informants, DeSimone had already committed several murders before the age of 25. Yet within the crew, Tommy was protected. Burke valued his loyalty, and Paul Vario valued Burke. Inside organized crime, that kind of protection could allow dangerous men to operate without consequence. Together, Hill, Burke, and DeSimone formed a tight inner circle. For years, they worked together across dozens of crimes: truck hijackings, gambling operations, loan sharking, and narcotics trafficking. The profits were enormous, but the stakes were rising. By the mid-1970s, law enforcement pressure on organized crime had intensified. Federal prosecutors had begun using new investigative tools, including long-term surveillance and the early applications of RICO statutes. The old methods of street crime were becoming riskier. Crews like Vario's needed bigger scores, more money, less exposure. That opportunity would arrive through a quiet airport employee with a gambling problem. Inside the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport, millions of dollars in international currency passed through the facility every week. Foreign airlines regularly transported large shipments of cash from overseas banks into the United States. The cargo terminal temporarily stored these funds before armored trucks transported them into Manhattan financial institutions. It was an enormous flow of money, and the security, at least at the time, was surprisingly vulnerable. One employee in particular had access to information about those shipments. His name was Louis Werner. Werner was a cargo supervisor responsible for overseeing incoming shipments. The job gave him knowledge of schedules, security procedures, and shipment manifests. But Werner also had a serious gambling problem, and like many men caught inside that cycle, he eventually owed money to the wrong people. One of those people was a bookmaker connected to the Lucchese family. Through that connection, word of the Lufthansa cargo cash shipments quietly reached members of the Vario crew. At first, it sounded impossible. Millions of dollars stored temporarily in a warehouse inside one of the busiest airports in the world. But organized crime has always been drawn to risk when the reward is large enough. The information eventually reached Jimmy Burke, and Burke began asking questions. How many guards? What alarms existed inside the building? How quickly could the police respond? The answers, according to later investigative reports, were troubling. The cargo terminal relied heavily on internal procedures rather than advanced security systems. Employees could be coerced. Doors could be opened. If a team moved quickly enough, the entire operation might take less than 20 minutes. But Burke understood something critical. A robbery of that scale required precision. Too many people involved, and the risk of exposure would multiply. Too few people, and the operation could fail. Planning began quietly in late 1978. Meetings were held in back rooms, bars, and social clubs across Brooklyn and Queens. Associates were evaluated for specific roles: drivers, lookouts, armed entrymen. But even within the Vario crew, information was tightly controlled. Many of the men who later claimed involvement would only learn pieces of the plan. And according to investigators who later reconstructed the operation, Henry Hill was not among the central planners. The film never showed that distinction. Hill knew about the robbery, but the true architect behind the heist was someone else entirely: Jimmy Burke. Burke had begun assembling a crew capable of pulling off the impossible. Inside the Lufthansa terminal, millions of dollars would soon arrive in an overnight shipment. The date was approaching, and the men chosen for the operation were preparing to move. But as the final planning meetings took place across Brooklyn, a dangerous problem had already begun to surface. Too many criminals knew that something enormous was coming. And inside the world of organized crime, knowledge can be just as dangerous as the crime itself. The robbery was only days away, and the men who would carry it out were already stepping into a plan that would soon make them the targets of one of the bloodiest internal purges in mafia history. The robbery was only days away, and the men who would carry it out were already stepping into a plan that would soon make them the targets of one of the bloodiest internal purges in mafia history. In early December 1978, the final pieces of the operation were quietly falling into place. According to multiple documented accounts from FBI investigators and later court testimony, the core crew selected for the robbery was carefully chosen by Jimmy Burke. The group included seasoned criminals who had already participated in hijackings, armed robberies, and cargo thefts throughout New York. Among them were men who understood discipline and others who understood violence. Burke did not plan to personally enter the Lufthansa building. That role would fall to a smaller team of armed participants. But he would control the operation from the outside, and he would control what happened after the money was taken. One of the key men selected for the job was Jimmy the Gent, Burke's trusted associate, Vincent Acero, along with several other experienced members of the Lucchese-linked crew. Another participant would be Parnell Stacks Edwards, whose job seemed simple but critical. He was assigned to dispose of the getaway van after the robbery. The van would be driven away from JFK Airport and abandoned at a prearranged location. From there, Edwards would transport it to a junkyard where it would be crushed. If that step failed, the entire operation could collapse. Every detail had been considered. Inside the Lufthansa cargo building, employees would be forced to cooperate. The robbers would move quickly, binding workers with tape and directing supervisors to open secured storage areas. The crew would target a specific shipment of foreign currency that had arrived hours earlier. Investigators later estimated the haul at approximately $5 million in cash, along with nearly $875,000 in jewelry. At the time, it was the largest cash robbery in American history. And yet, on the night it happened, the operation unfolded with shocking simplicity. Shortly after 3 a.m. on December 11th, 1978, a van carrying the robbery crew pulled into the Lufthansa cargo terminal area at JFK Airport. The terminal was quiet. Overnight cargo operations were routine at the airport. Workers were accustomed to trucks and delivery vehicles arriving throughout the night. The robbers wore ski masks. 2 of them approached the entrance while others waited inside the vehicle. According to surviving employee testimony, the men moved with calm efficiency. Inside the building, employees were quickly subdued. The robbers carried handguns, but fired no shots. Workers were ordered to lie on the floor. Some were tied up. Others were forced to help move through the facility. One supervisor was taken directly to the storage area where the international currency shipments were kept. Within minutes, the robbers had reached their target. Stacks of cash, packed into bags and boxes, were loaded rapidly onto hand carts and moved toward the waiting van. No alarms were triggered. No police were alerted. The entire robbery lasted less than 15 minutes. When the van finally pulled away from the terminal, it carried nearly $6 million in stolen money. For the crew involved, the operation had succeeded beyond expectation. But the success created a problem that Jimmy Burke understood immediately. The heist was too large, and too many men knew about it. Inside organized crime, large sums of money bring celebration, but they also bring suspicion. Burke had spent years operating within the rules of the mafia. Those rules were simple. Major crimes required approval from the higher ranks of the family. The Lufthansa heist had not received that approval. The robbery was carried out under the authority of the Vario crew, but the enormous profit meant that powerful figures in the Lucchese family would demand their share. Burke knew the money would attract attention from multiple directions. Federal investigators, mob bosses, and most dangerous of all, the criminals who had helped carry out the job. Within hours of the robbery, Burke began enforcing strict instructions. No one was to spend large amounts of money. No expensive cars. No sudden displays of wealth. The cash would be distributed slowly, quietly, carefully. But the men involved in the heist had just participated in the largest robbery in American history, and discipline quickly began to break down. The first mistake came almost immediately. Parnell Stacks Edwards, the man responsible for destroying the getaway van, failed to complete his task. Instead of driving the vehicle to the junkyard as instructed, Edwards parked the van near his girlfriend's apartment. Investigators would later discover it within days. Inside the vehicle were fingerprints, hair fibers, evidence that connected the robbery directly to Burke's crew. For Jimmy Burke, this was unacceptable. According to multiple accounts from mob informants, Burke made a decision almost immediately. Stacks Edwards had become a liability. Only a few days after the robbery, Edwards was found dead inside his apartment. He had been shot multiple times. His body was left as a warning. But the killings did not stop there. The film Goodfellas briefly portrays a wave of murders following the Lufthansa heist. But the truth was even more systematic. Burke began eliminating members of the crew one by one. Some had attracted attention by purchasing expensive cars. Others had talked too openly about the robbery. And some were simply men Burke no longer trusted. According to investigators who later reconstructed the events, the killings unfolded across several weeks. Bodies began appearing across New York. One man was discovered inside a garbage truck. Another was found shot to death inside a car. Others vanished entirely. Many of the men who had risked their lives during the robbery never lived long enough to spend their share. The money itself became a source of paranoia. Burke understood something few of the others fully grasped. The more people who knew about the robbery, the greater the risk that someone would eventually talk. so the number of people who knew how to shrink violently. During this period, Henry Hill remained close to the crew, but increasingly outside the core decisions. The film never showed how little control Hill actually had over the aftermath. He had not entered the terminal. He had not been part of the armed robbery team. And as the killings began, he watched events unfold largely from the sidelines. But Hill understood what was happening. Jimmy Burke was cleaning house. Anyone connected to the Lufthansa heist could eventually become expendable, and the bodies were beginning to pile up. Meanwhile, the robbery had triggered one of the largest criminal investigations in FBI history. Within days, federal agents were working alongside the Port Authority police and New York detectives to track down the perpetrators. The amount of stolen money made the crime impossible to ignore. Investigators quickly began identifying potential suspects. Many of those names pointed toward the same group of criminals, the Vario crew. Surveillance operations intensified. Wiretaps were installed. Informants were quietly approached. But proving involvement in the robbery would prove extremely difficult. Most of the participants were already dead. Others had vanished. And the man believed to be orchestrating the operation, Jimmy Burke, had been careful to avoid direct connection. Yet the investigation continued to tighten around the crew. And inside that pressure, another dangerous development was already beginning. Henry Hill had started moving deeper into narcotics trafficking. It was a decision that violated a strict rule imposed by Paul Vario. No drugs. The rule existed for a reason. Drug charges carried long prison sentences, and long prison sentences often produced informants. But Hill had already crossed the line. He was making enormous profits through cocaine distribution, and federal investigators had begun to notice. By 1980, surveillance teams were tracking his movements. Phone calls were being recorded, and the walls were slowly closing in. For Henry Hill, the Lufthansa heist had brought attention, suspicion, and a wave of violence that was far from over. But the real danger was still approaching. Because in the world of organized crime, loyalty only lasts as long as it is useful. And soon, Jimmy Burke would begin to suspect that Henry Hill himself had become another liability. Jimmy Burke would begin to suspect that Henry Hill himself had become another liability. By the spring of 1980, the world that Hill had once admired as a teenager was beginning to close in on him from every direction. For years, he had operated comfortably inside the orbit of the Vario crew. He moved stolen goods, handled logistics for hijackings, and helped coordinate the quiet criminal businesses that had flourished across Brooklyn and Queens. But the environment surrounding organized crime had changed. Federal investigators were no longer relying on short-term arrests or isolated prosecutions. They were building long-term cases. Surveillance teams followed suspects for months. Financial records were examined. Telephone calls were recorded. And the men who once believed they were untouchable were beginning to make mistakes. Henry Hill made one of the biggest. Despite direct warnings from Paul Vario, Hill had become deeply involved in narcotics trafficking. The rule inside the Lucchese family had always been clear. No drugs. Not because the mob had moral objections, but because narcotics investigations carried severe federal penalties. A man facing decades in prison might decide to cooperate with authorities. Drug operations attracted the wrong kind of attention. But Hill ignored the rule. Working with a network of associates in Pittsburgh and New York, he began distributing large quantities of cocaine. The profits were enormous. The risks were even greater. By late 1979, federal agents had begun monitoring the operation. Investigators later discovered that Hill had grown increasingly careless. Phone conversations discussing cocaine deals were recorded. Meetings were observed. Transactions were tracked. For the first time in years, Hill was becoming the focus of a serious federal investigation. And inside the Vario crew, his actions were creating another problem. Because Hill's drug operation was drawing attention to a crew that was already under scrutiny for something much larger. The Lufthansa Heist. In April 1980, the situation reached its breaking point. Henry Hill was arrested during a narcotics investigation involving cocaine distribution. The charges were serious. If convicted, Hill faced a long prison sentence, potentially decades behind bars. For most criminals operating within organized crime, that moment represented a final test of loyalty. Prison was considered part of the life. Talking to authorities was forbidden. But Hill understood something about the men he had worked beside for years. Loyalty inside the mafia was conditional, and after the Lufthansa heist, he had already watched what happened to men who became inconvenient. Bodies had appeared across New York. Others had simply vanished. Jimmy Burke had removed anyone he believed could expose the robbery. Now Hill had become exactly that kind of risk. A man under federal pressure. A man with knowledge. A man who might talk. But there was another problem. Hill himself had begun to suspect that Burke might already be preparing to eliminate him. According to Hill's later testimony, the warning signs had appeared slowly. Burke's behavior had changed. Conversations had become colder. Meetings were arranged in unfamiliar locations. At one point, Burke allegedly asked Hill to travel to Florida to help resolve a business matter. Hill believed the trip was a setup. Several mob associates had previously been sent on similar trips. They never returned. Investigators later confirmed that multiple members of the Lufthansa robbery crew had disappeared under circumstances strongly suggesting Burke's involvement. By 1980, Hill was no longer certain he would survive long enough to face trial, and that realization led to one of the most significant decisions in the history of organized crime investigations. Henry Hill agreed to cooperate with the federal government. For the mafia, the act had a name: breaking omerta, the code of silence that had governed organized crime for generations. Hill's cooperation provided federal prosecutors with something they rarely obtained: a detailed insider account of the structure and operations of a major mafia crew. Over the following months, Hill gave investigators extensive testimony about the Vario crew, the Lucchese family, and dozens of criminal operations. Truck hijackings, extortion, loan sharking, narcotics trafficking, and the aftermath of the Lufthansa heist. Although Hill had not personally participated in the robbery itself, he described the structure of the crew that carried it out. He explained the relationships between Jimmy Burke, Paul Vario, and the various associates involved, and he provided investigators with something they had struggled to obtain for years: context. The FBI had long suspected Burke's involvement in the Lufthansa robbery, but proving it in court remained difficult. Most of the men directly involved were already dead. Others refused to testify. But Hill's cooperation helped investigators reconstruct the events surrounding the heist and the violent purge that followed. It also triggered a series of prosecutions. Paul Vario was eventually convicted on racketeering charges and sentenced to prison. He died behind bars in 1988. Several other members of the crew faced lengthy sentences for crimes connected to the criminal enterprises Hill had described. Jimmy Burke, the man believed by investigators to be the true architect behind the Lufthansa heist, would never be convicted for the robbery itself, but his criminal career eventually caught up with him. In 1982, Burke was convicted for his role in the 1979 murder of Richard Eaton, a cocaine dealer with connections to the crew. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Behind bars, his reputation remained unchanged. Burke was still considered dangerous, still feared, still respected within certain criminal circles. But the empire he had controlled from the streets of Brooklyn was gone. Jimmy Burke died in prison in 1996, never having faced trial for the Lufthansa robbery that had made him infamous. Henry Hill's fate was different. After agreeing to cooperate with federal authorities, Hill and his family entered the Witness Protection Program. For a time, he lived under a new identity in undisclosed locations across the United States. The transition was difficult. Former mob associates were now potential assassins. Old habits proved hard to abandon, and Hill struggled to adapt to a life outside the criminal world he had known since adolescence. Yet his testimony had already changed the landscape of organized crime prosecutions. Federal investigators increasingly relied on insider witnesses to dismantle mafia families across the country. The silence that had protected organized crime for decades was beginning to fracture. Years later, Hill's story would reach a global audience. In 1990, director Martin Scorsese released the film Goodfellas, based largely on Hill's own account of his life inside the mafia. The movie became one of the most influential crime films ever produced. It portrayed the Lufthansa heist as a central moment in Hill's criminal career, but the film never showed the full complexity of the truth. Henry Hill had not masterminded the robbery. He had not been inside the cargo terminal, and the true architect of the operation, Jimmy Burke, had operated largely in the shadows. The heist itself was only the beginning of a far darker chain of events, because the real story of Lufthansa was not just about a robbery. It was about what happened after the money disappeared. Bodies in garbage trucks, men vanishing without explanation, criminal partners eliminating one another to protect their own survival. According to investigators who spent years studying the case, the Lufthansa robbery ultimately destroyed nearly everyone connected to it. Some died violently, others died in prison, and the fortune that had seemed so enormous on that winter night in 1978 was scattered, seized, or lost. The crime that once looked perfect had quietly consumed the men who carried it out. And in the end, the most enduring legacy of the Lufthansa heist was not the money that was stolen. It was the silence that followed, a silence broken only years later by the testimony of a man who realized that in the world he had once admired, loyalty was never stronger than survival.